this morning is to try to rehabilitate the concept of nationalism and ultimately to show its relationship to religion, and to argue that both these concepts play an important role in creating just societies that are best suited for promoting human flourishing. I really won't get to the religion part today. That will be continued for those of you who are going to Alterity at the seminar. I'd like to begin with a New York Times story published on May 23rd. It's entitled, "Italy's Populists Get a Green Light to Govern in New Threat to Europe." The story went as follows. The rapid ascent of populists in Italy, the birthplace of fascism, a founding member of the European Union and the bloc's fourth largest economy, shattered the nation's decade-old party system. It also gave fresh energy to the nationalist impulses tugging at the continent and moved the greatest threat to the European Union's cohesion from newer member states on the periphery, such as Hungary and Poland, to its very core. End quote. Now look at the built-in assumptions, the major premises that are hidden in this little story that many, I'm sure, read and found unremarkable, or perhaps taking the bait, worrisome and troubling. Why should populism be compared to fascism? Why should fascism be compared to nationalism? Why is the growth of populism and nationalism a threat to the European Union? I propose to look at nationalism and ultimately its connection to religion in the context of the very negative perception that is common today, and argue, as I indicated, that it and religion are vital for societies that promote human flourishing. A common thing that emerges in the discussion of nationalism is that it is a reaction, a primitive rankovist reaction to globalization. Yuval Harari, for instance, the Israeli historian and author of *Sapiens, A Brief History of Humankind*, believes that the biggest political question facing humanity today is the tension between nationalism and globalism. Humanity is confronting problems that can only be solved if we think and act together as a species, not as members of individual nations. Yet over against this position is the perdurance of nationalism. Even the communist revolutions of the 20th century that promised a new international consciousness have given place to nationalism in places like China, Russia, and Vietnam. In addition, there are powerful nationalist movements sweeping the United States and Europe. President Donald Trump's MAGA, Make America Great Again movement, continues to grow in America. I live in the middle of Washington, D.C. Despite the relentless, nearly crazed opposition of the left and others. And in Europe, parties like Greece's Syriza or Italy's Movimento 5 Stelle, hardly right-wing organizations, demonstrate that, as does the Lega in Italia, the Alternative for Germany, UKIP in the UK, FPO in Austria, PPD in the Netherlands, the National Front in Belgium, PNR in Portugal, Marine Le Pen in the French National Front, Andrzej Duda in Poland, Viktor Orban in Hungary, Miloš Zeman in the Czech Republic. They're all part of a wave of nationalism. I'm not suggesting that they're all alike in every way, but they're part of this challenge to globalization. And on the edges of Europe, we have Recep Erdogan in Turkey, Vladimir Putin in Russia, and in Asia, there are BJP, Hindutva-inspired India on the rise, and the most nationalistic force on earth, that somehow often gets left out of this, the People's Republic of China. I'd like to proceed with three parts, only the first two of which we'll get to today. What is nationalism? Secondly, and crucial to our time together today, what is the relationship between liberalism and nationalism? And third, the relationship between religion and nationalism. Nationalism, What is it? Is it simply patriotism? Is it simply, are there different types of nationalism? I shall make a distinction that will be important to keep in mind between ethnic nationalism and civic nationalism. Civic nationalism is sometimes called republicanism. That's what I'm really advocating here. The Marxist historian Benedict Anderson admitted candidly in 1983 that the communist effort to create an international movement of the proletariat, which tried to define itself in ideological rather than national terms, failed. The end of the era of nationalism was not anywhere in sight, he thought. Despite the definitional and ontological problems that the conception of nation has, he noted that it robustly had endured. Though an imagined identity, nationalism is for most people a very real thing, something for which they would sacrifice their very lives to protect. Anderson's premise is based on his conception of nationalism as a creation of the industrial age that caused persons to abandon traditional modes in favor of new, imagined communities, created for them by the economic and political powers. Anderson's widely praised 1983 book, Imagined Communities, is an intellectual tour de force, which, however, uses examples that hardly anybody has any knowledge of. It reminds me a little bit of Eliade's great works in religion. In Benedict Anderson's case, the examples come from Oceania and Southeast Asia. Anderson is not alone, but he argues that nationalism is essentially a creation of the capitalist era, that people were basically hoodwinked into thinking about the concept of nation as a new identity, hence an imagined identity, that is really the product of oppression in final analysis. Now, he's not alone in thinking of nationalism as a creation of the late 18th and early 19th century. Consider also the 1971 New Cambridge Modern History, J.P.T. Barry, say the following historical summary of the emergence of nationalities and nationalism in the 19th century in Europe. Quote, the years around 1830 were momentous for the progress of a cause little regarded in 1815, the cause of nationality. Barry notes that the word nationality was accepted by the Académie Française in 1835. In 1834, Russians started to use a term with a somewhat unclear meaning that meant something like nationality. In Germany and England, similarly, the new craze seemed to grow. By mid-century, people were noting that the term conveyed something new, not only nation, but also the something in virtue of which a nation continues to exist, even when it has lost its autonomy, such as the experience of Romanians. Nationalism might also imply different things for different people, Barry goes on to note. For liberals, it might mean liberty and popular sovereignty. For conservatives, it might mean maintaining native traditions and following the ideas that have always ordered society. For others, it could mean a type of community spirit conveyed by a common heritage of language, culture, and reminding people of their common bonds of blood and their special relations to land. And for people like Giuseppe Mazzini, it was the beginning not only of a nationalism and Italian nationalism, but a new internationalism. But surely, the idea of nationalism as a new creation that it comes about in the 19th century must be a bit of an exaggeration. How could one say there was not a sense of nationality, for instance, in France prior to the 19th century, or in England? Did not Shakespeare say, I do love my country's good, with respect more tender, more holy and profound than mine own life, my dear wife's estimate, her womb's increase, and the treasure of my loins? Did he not say it long before the Industrial Revolution? Did he not say it about England, already a power, whose influence spread across the oceans? What of Spain, created by Isabella and Ferdinand? Since when was it unusual for people to unite in something beyond tribes and families? Surely, if there had not been a deep affinity toward this idea, it could not have taken on the even stronger dimensions, which it undoubtedly did in the 19th century. But nationality and nationalism have deeper roots than those found in the 19th century. There is something much deeper. It has to do with place, blood, soil. These are not new ideas manufactured by capitalists to exploit the workers, and these are not ideas that have to end in the horror of National Socialism and fascism. These are ideas that run deep in human experience. Cities and cultures require them. Humans have long sought loyalties beyond narrow tribes and families. Skipping on to the next page. Why is it then that somebody like Barry and Anderson find this so remarkable? I think in Barry's case and in Anderson's case, the answer has to be found not so much in history, but in plain self-interest. For the British Barry, nationalism was fine for the British nation, but worrisome when it came to Italians, Romanians, or Poles, who were threatening to throw off their foreign rulers and build their own nation. For Anderson, his theory is born in his Marxist faith that tells him that loyalties to a nation might stand in the way of loyalties to class. Workers might not think themselves simply as persons defined by labor and capital, looking to an international struggle against capitalists. They might think of themselves rather as Frenchmen or Englishmen, loyal to their national, very real communities. As Benedict Anderson and others ask, what's wrong with you people? Can't you see how this imagined fiction of national loyalty is keeping you down? Many might reply that the only thing that is imagined is the Marxist tale of alienation, not the bonds of place that have linked people for centuries. Now, some might counter that the sentiment of loyalty to one's homeland is patriotism. Patriotism good, nationalism bad. I think that's facile, as I will illustrate in the second section on nationalism and liberalism. Does democracy lead only to civic nationalism? Is ethnic nationalism a more primitive form of nationalism that is based on defining others as enemies and outsiders? We know it can lead to that. It did in this continent last century. But is that the only thing that can happen when we start to talk about populism and nationalism? Now, it's been widely acknowledged by political theorists over the ages that democracy leads to individualism. In the American context, you remember Tocqueville clearly saw that the problem could emerge, but he hoped that the Americans' habits of the heart, their ability to form volunteer associations, their religion, among other, and their voluntarism could spare them the evils of individualism. Individualism, he feared, could lead to partisanship, which would cause a breakdown in society. Isolated individuals were also prey to tyrants. But does liberalism lead to nationalism? We speak of liberalism, we have to speak about it as it is today rather than as an abstract political theory. In this context, I'd like to speak about it following John J. Mearsheimer on the roots of liberal hegemony. So in the context of international relations, if you will. Mearsheimer is most interested in international relations, and his argument talks about nation-states based on the conception of liberalism being the dominant and really only viable form of political organization, especially after the fall of the Soviet Union. He contrasts liberalism with realism and nationalism. Liberalism is international while nationalism is local. Liberalism proceeds on the following basis. First, it assumes that human beings are incapable of agreeing on first principles. Therefore, in a Hobbesian contract, they come together and give up certain rights merely because they wish to be safe from the constant state of war of all against all. As part of that social contract, they agree to three things. First, that there are certain inalienable rights. These may be positive or negative rights. Second, they agree to tolerate one another's opinions and one another's access to those rights. Everyone has rights, so we'll have to tolerate others and their different opinions, if we expect to be tolerated ourselves. Third, the state must act as a night watchman to enforce tolerance. This focus on the individual turns liberalism into universalistic ideology. It does not begin with the conception of humans as members of groups, as nationalism does, but with humans as individuals possessing certain inalienable rights. There are two types of liberalism, classical and progressive, and it's particularly progressive liberalism that I am concerned with, which is the dominant form today. It believes that the state must socially engineer society to create a level playing field and even to create equal outcomes. So there are certain rights that are raised to the level of positive rights which might not have any warrant even in natural rights, perhaps like rights to health care and education. Social engineering, that is the penchant of progressive liberals, has only been stoked in the 20th century, the rise of large-scale governments, the rise of large-scale warfare. Liberal hegemony has been the practice of leading Western states in the 20th century. The American foreign policy establishment, part of what Donald Trump calls the swamp, is deeply wedded to it. Currently, much of the opposition to Trump stems from the belief that he threatens some assumptions of this philosophy, but nevertheless, America still generally has followed a policy that views persons as individuals with inalienable rights which it somehow has a duty to protect both at home and across the world. Borders don't count. People are essentially the same in their possession of rights, and others, especially it seems Americans and our soldiers, have a responsibility to protect those rights. This can change. This can range from minor rescue missions to even regime change. Liberal democratic peace theory says that a liberal democratic world will be more likely to avoid war and embrace peace because it will tolerate differences and respect the rights and opinions of others. So liberal hegemony likes the term community, such as the European community or the international community, and especially in a unipolar world, it's easy to pursue this evangelical style of liberal progressivism. Mearsheimer and others worry that in a new world in which unipolar world gives way to something else, it might be a little more difficult, and we might have an emergence of nationalism and realism. Now, returning from the world of international relations for a moment, there are different reasons to be concerned about progressive liberalism as an alternative to nationalism. In the first place, nationalism, contrary to how it's presented often today, is not fundamentally a vehicle for the repression of human rights. To the contrary, civic nationalism is based on the idea that you can create a state that is more than just a tribe. Think of it. That's what a nation is. More than an ethnic large family. And you can do that around notions of public interest, shared values, and shared space. Here is where the near consistent praise of Hobbes' conception of negative rights may be fundamentally wrong. Societies are not created merely as alternatives to war. Human liberties do not consist only in either those that are given by the state as positive rights or those that are given by the state's indifference, that is, negative rights. Societies are shaped by a participation in the common good, a good that is in the individual's interest to pursue because it is grounded in his own nature, a nature that is social, as the Archbishop said. So the family is the first step towards society, but the nation moves us beyond family to say that we have something in common with those with whom we share a space and an idea about how our country should be run, what it should stand for. That may be either supplied by democratic process, or as we'll see, it may be supplied in part by religion. And classically, it was supplied by the king, who ruled with God's favor. Far from being the source of hatred and ethnic strife, the nation is just the opposite. The nation is the antidote to tribalism. the alternative to small-scale societies in which families are the only real social organizations. How nationalism is different from globalism and liberal progressivism becomes clear when we think of the scope of the national reach. Nationalism is local. It is based not primarily on new imagined creations, but on traditions. Traditions are shared experiences that have been passed from one generation to the next because they work in producing human flourishing. Liberal progressivism, by contrast, sees persons as individuals with inalienable rights, while the welfare state, which the welfare state must respect and promulgate. The emphasis is on rights and privileges rather than on duties and obligations to the past and future generations. International organizations, whether they are the European Union, the UN, or the WTO, are all completely imagined communities. They are the ones who think they can create a better world merely by wishing for or conceiving of it. Nationalism is more modest in its scope and therefore more realistic. Communism hates nationalism and liberal progressivism hates nationalism because it says to both utopian urges, no, we can't. Yes, we can is the cant of the progressives who really think themselves smarter than all the generations before and misread Hobbes' thinking that he ushered in a new world in which negative liberty and new positive rights, which the state must then preserve, can ever be the basis of the social order. Hobbes was very clear. The basis of the social order was the sovereign. What liberal progressives have done in their misreading of Hobbes is to leave out the sovereign. Now, to be fair, I must also address the objections to nationalism, which you as Europeans are very aware of. Again, ethnic nationalism is a reality, and it can lead to distortions which I do not have to remind you about. But I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about civic nationalism or republicanism. So I think that's enough for today. Thank you very much.
Farina. I invite you to have 5 minutes for debate for questions. Yes, please, Professor Patrick. Press the blue button. Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, I think I can speak now.
Yeah.
Thank you, Professor John. It was a good beginning for our conference. Situating our discourse within the discourse of the emergence of nationalism, its relationship to religion, morality, and things like that. My question is, you see, in the emergence of nationalism in the modern times, there is something distributionally different from the kind of patriotism that we had in the pre-modern times. So, can we not also include the role of modernity in the emergence of nationalism? Say, for example, this goes on development. This goes on, say, universalism. This goes on progress. I think they all contributed to, certainly, what we call the modern nationalism, which also became problematic. Now, another question is, when you finish, towards the end, you said, the civic nationalism that you are proposing, which is fine, wonderful. I think that is a good solution that you are proposing, civic nationalism. But how would you kind of relate that to what we call the republicanism, which has a, kind of a not very good kind of history, kind of ambiguous history, especially in the American context. Republicanism. Who is we? You said towards the end.
Yeah, I hear what you're saying, but I don't understand. So you have to elaborate. The last point about why is republicanism a problem in the American context?
How do you actually relate the new civic nationalism that you are proposing to the republicanism that has been there, I think, in the American context for a long time.
Well, I see republicanism and civic nationalism as pretty much the same thing. And ethnic nationalism is different, but America has never had ethnic nationalism. We are not. What's an American? Good luck with that. You know, there's no ethnic nationalism in the United States, never has been. That much we have right. I mean, that's just fundamentally, that's the fundamental difference. That's why it is a new order of the ages. You know, that it is fundamentally different from every older society in that there is no ethnic basis for American citizenship. We have a shared space and a shared idea. And if you share that idea and share the space, you're an American. So maybe that's a model for civic nationalism, which I take to be Republicanism.
Maybe it can be discussed.
Yeah, we will continue our discussion during the seminar from Patagony. Professor John Farina will continue his presentation there, the same line. So if there are other questions, yes, Professor Osman Gülen, please.
Okay, thank you, John. I take your presentation not as a defense of nationalism, but more like a criticism of liberalism and communism in a sense. Their idealistic attitude. But I wonder whether there is a danger here in this kind of what you call civic nationalism turning into a religious nationalism, because in the process of 19th century's nationalism, even the differences within the same religious communities, what we call sects, define the borders. So just excuse my ignorance probably, but what is the difference between Slovenia and the Slovakia? You see? So, other than, so basically those are Slavic, I mean, countries from their namesake, and as you mentioned, different but similar. In what? In certain symbols and more, probably details. What we call Satan is in the details. So can you just elaborate more on when religion stands in this description of yours as a civic nationalism?
Well, thank you. Those are very good points, and I think you're right. I can't do that simply. That's why I didn't begin that third part. But it plays a huge role, and I will admit, and that's why dialogue is interesting. It's very easy for me as Americans to think about civic nationalism, because again, we've never had ethnic nationalism. It's just not part of our experience. Ethnic nationalism is a deforming force. And many of those movements that I read, the long list of movements, many of them, I'm sure, have strong elements of ethnic nationalism. And so for me to lump them with Trump and Make America Great Again, a kind of civic nationalism, is, I don't need to equate them all. And it really is always a very big problem that I have when I start to think of, ideally, of models, political models, and I say, well, just how about republicanism? But I don't live in a country where the past walks beside me every moment, as it does in so many other societies. And I feel that. When I get to Europe, when I get to Asia, especially to Europe, I feel the past walking behind me in a way. In Americans, we don't, to almost a crazy degree. I mean, I work at a university. One of our, you know what the motto of my university is? Where innovation is tradition. What does that mean? What does that mean, though? I mean, it's like, so again, so you hear my sort of longing for more traditional ways, because I live in a very untraditional place.
Okay, another question from Professor Mendo. Enriquez from Portugal. He comes this morning from Portugal. Welcome.
Another one from the left. You sit there. You can get it.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you, Archbishop Petrescu, for inviting me here, and Jan. Professor Farina, I have two questions. First, I thought you were going to say something to us about the role of political messianism as regards the relation between nationalism and religion. I would like you to elaborate more. What is precisely that relation between religion and nationalism? And second question, as an European and as a Portuguese, what you said about the European Union sounds to us a bit outlandish, because of course the founding fathers of Europe, some 60 years ago, they founded the European Union because they have just observed a clash, a tragic clash between nationalisms, German, Italian, and so on. So, of course, the European Union is not, as you said, an imagined community at all. It is a process in construction, very complex, but not, as Anderson says, an imagined community. Thank you.
Again, I cannot briefly at all speak about what I mean by religion and its relation to nationalism, so pardon me. I will do that if I was I take your point, but I do think that the European Union is a product of progressive liberalism, which was my point. And it is clearly a product of progressive liberalism. That doesn't make it bad, but it makes it idealistic project, not one rooted in history. It is a new project. It is by definition a progressive liberal project. It shares all those assumptions, which was, and we can debate. Now, your point about political messianism, again, those are all very valid points, and, you know, the question is, again, most people say, well, why do you even use the term? Why? Because nationalism is such a fraught term because of these histories. Why even use the term? And so I understand that, and it's valid. But I do so to try to challenge the assumptions, again, that the New York Times article just perfectly exhibits. It's preposterous to think that anytime somebody thinks about localism, tradition, place, over international, imagined, I'm sorry, but imagined communities, that it's all the result of negativism is my main burden that I'm trying to carry here. But thank you for your comment.